Hey guys, wow, someone's on already. That took like 0.30 milliseconds. Is that something? Crooked. All right. Hey guys, Teresa Joy coming live to you today for Jordan Sheridan Reports. Just wait a second and wait for people to hop on. But today I want to talk about the lead crisis, which is nationwide, and also about the Poor People's Campaign and people getting arrested for asking for the basic human rights. Basic human rights. Um, so, waiting. It is what? 5:30 on Tuesday. I hope you're having a wonderful day. I hope you got to see all of Jordan's videos from Flint. He was in Flint. I can't even remember how long he was there. Really digging up some vital information, which goes along with my story that I'm about to talk to you about, in which the problem where we have a lead crisis and people can't drink their water is it's corrupt. They're trying to hide it. They're using different tactics to hide it. Our government and the people in control know very well what the hell is going on. And it's not just happening in Flint, it's happening all over the United States. So, hi from Georgia. Georgia. I've been to Georgia once. Beautiful. So, let me begin. This is sort of how Jordan and I crossed paths, or how I ended up reporting for him, is that I was covering the lead crisis in Buffalo, New York, which is my hometown, for a very long time, and trying to bring light to it. And still to this day, I'm sure you don't know about the lead crisis in Buffalo, so I guess I wasn't that successful about, it's frustrating. It's frustrating. You find out all this corruption, and then you bring it out in the public, and then nothing happens and people are still suffering. So I do want to talk about Buffalo today. Let me just clean my glasses. So Jordan found out a lot of things while he was in Flint that I found out in Buffalo. So if you didn't know, Buffalo is ground zero for lead poisoning in the United States. The east and lower west side of Buffalo, 40% of children tested high for lead levels. Some of them 8 times higher than that of Flint, Michigan at its peak. Now, this isn't to say to take away from the problem in Flint, not at all. This is to say this is happening all over the country, and there are some places that are much worse. And now, of course, Flint has problems with their water that go beyond just lead. There's other chemicals and things going on with their water there that is continuing to make people sick. But so this has been going on in Buffalo. I think the first report came out in 2002, where they tested neighborhoods, and the lead levels, these children were testing, 40% of these children were testing high, dangerously high for lead levels. Once again, some of them 8 times higher than that of Flint. That came out in 2002. This is driving me nuts. I'm sorry. What is it? Better? So that came out in 2002. And since then, nothing has been done. Nothing has been done. So this information was gained through the Freedom of Information Law. We requested records from 2002, 2005, 2008, 2011, 2014. Again, this is in Buffalo, New York, requesting information on lead. The records show that the city did not test the water in the neighborhoods where children were testing high for lead poisoning. Instead, they tested the neighborhoods where children were not testing positive for lead at all, or very, very, very minute amounts of children had tested positive for lead. Only 1/3 of the samples the city collected came from homes in the 5 zip codes that were the highest lead levels, where 91% of the children were testing reported high lead poisoning. These neighborhoods are 66% minority. They did not test in those neighborhoods. Instead, the city focused on predominantly white neighborhoods in North and South Buffalo that reported few, if any, lead poisoning cases. The city collected only 5 of the 300 samples in the past 5 rounds of testing from homes located in the zip codes that tested positive for lead. It collected 5 of 300 samples from the zip codes that tested positive for lead. By contrast, the city collected 41 of the 300 samples from homes and zip codes that cover predominantly, again, white neighborhoods where not a single child was diagnosed. This is a violation of federal laws. But what do we have laws for anymore if they mean nothing? I mean, laws only apply to average people like you and I, right? This is a federal law. The city broke it, but nothing happened. So what is the use of having these laws? They look good on paper. So they violated the city law because the law said that testing should focus its efforts on houses that are most at risk, which they did not. Federal law requires that at least half of the homes sampled are deemed most at risk, which they did not follow that law. The law requires every home sampled have lead plumbing, and at least half must have lead service lines that run from the street into the homes. Now, the records that were obtained showed that 62 homes sampled in 2014, only 28 households had lead service lines. So again, breaking federal law. But it didn't matter, right? It doesn't matter. The law doesn't apply. Among the homes the city sampled, 1/4 of the houses sampled in 2014 belonged to current or former employees of the city and their family members. Many of those employees worked for Water and Public Works Department. Among the homes the city sampled that year was the former chief plumbing plant engineer, employed by the city for 30 years, a water treatment supervisor, employed for 28 years, a chemist, employed for 23 years, public works employees, a parking enforcement officer, a senior engineer, an assemblywoman. They're testing all these people's water for lead, but not the 5 zip codes where children were testing 40% positive for incredibly high lead levels. But it's not just that they're doing this, they're testing it and it goes nowhere. Then they're going on the news and they're going in the newspaper and they're saying Buffalo has no water problem because they didn't test the right homes, they didn't test the right zip codes. So in response, the mayor said, "I'm not concerned because our water is good in the city of Buffalo." And when this came out, people were, it was going around, Buffalo has a lead problem. The mayor went on the news with this information that they did from the skewed water testing and told the public, these are the results of the test, our water is good. So they didn't test the right areas, the water wasn't good. People in those 5 minority zip codes, their children are sick, their children are suffering, their children are still struggling to this day. This was 2002. It is 2018 right now. Nothing has been done. And so it's lies, it's being covered up, but the children are still sick. So the mayor said that anyone can participate in the city's sampling program to test their waters, and that we're not ignoring the neighborhood. He said they have the ability to contact us and request water to be tested, and that they're receiving flyers in the mail is what he said. I spoke to a lot of people. I personally went and spoke to a lot of people that said flyers never came to their home. So we did a little digging. We found out that the flyers were being sent to the landlords of the homes. So if you have a house where you have two people living, two families living in it, four families living in it, the landlord's getting that piece of paper that says, if you want your water tested, please call us, contact us here. The resident, like the people living in the homes, never got that paper. And of course, the landlords aren't going to want the residents to know that there's a lead problem in their home, because then they're going to have to fix it. So that's very strategic, of course, by the city, that they would put out these flyers and send them only to landlords and not in the mail of the residents. They definitely did it on purpose. And then they could go on the news again and say, we sent out flyers to all the residents, everything's okay. Those residents, they got the flyers, and if they want to get their water tested, they can. The residents never got the flyers. The residents never got their water tested. So Buffalo's aging drinking water infrastructure is part of the growing problem in New York, and it's not the only problem. It is estimated to cost $40 billion. So why would our government want to put $40 billion into fixing the drinking water for minority neighborhoods, right? I mean, we have more important things like dropping bombs on Syria and Yemen and building a wall and paying the upper 1%, giving them tax breaks. That's what we want to do. That's what our politicians want to do in this country. They don't want to take care of the actual citizens. They're catering to the billionaires and the huge corporations, the industrial war machine and such, and their own pockets. So they are largely ignoring the fact that children's lives are being robbed, their futures are being robbed across the country. And I'll tell you in a minute, this is a nationwide crisis. It's not just Buffalo, it's not just Flint. So the Guardian newspaper found that at least 33 cities, including Buffalo, used cheats that could reduce the amount of lead in drinking water for sampling. And I spoke to the residents about this. I have some interviews. I will post them. And they said this is exactly what happened. This is exactly what they were told to do. Or if someone did come to their house to test the water, this is exactly how it went. In fact, Buffalo's water utility was one of the handful that cheated on all three measures by instructing the residents to, and this is the cheats, and this is what Jordan found out that they were doing in Flint. This is the cheats. This is what they do to make it seem like if they do test the water, that the water is clean. Number one, flush faucets prior to testing, which removes water that may have been in contact with lead plumbing. Clean filter screens inside faucets, which can remove flakes of lead. Literally, they told the residents, or they would come and test the water, and they would remove the filter and clean it before they tested the water. Run the water slowly while collecting samples, and that prevents any additional lead particles from flaking off inside the pipes. Just doing everything they possibly can to make sure that they cheat and the results are skewed, so that they don't have to put a dime into fixing the infrastructure, into literally ensuring that the Americans of this country have a future, that the children have a future. Because what happens when people have lead poisoning? They have learning disabilities, attention deficit disorder, proclivity to violence. It is a neurological, it impairs you neurologically. And not just that, I mean, one of the women I interviewed, her daughter was right there with us. She goes to the hospital 2 to 3 times a month at this point. And unfortunately, she's still living in the house. Her lead levels were testing 40, which you're supposed to have 0 lead in your blood. And they're saying anything over 4 or 5 requires like a public health assistance. And this child was between 30 and 40 on a regular basis. And sometimes she would have to get, I can't remember if it's called ketosis, chelation. chelation on a regular basis. She would have to clean her blood. And the Department of Health knew about this. The Department of Health had been to her home multiple times. HUD knows about this. The city knew about this. This is one example of how many are in Buffalo that are suffering the same fate. And this poor child is now, I think she's 12. And she suffers, and she still lives in the same home because in her case, her mother went to HUD housing and she said, we have lead in our home. My daughter has tested high for lead levels. And they said, if we move you to a different house, it's going to have lead anyways. So and what they instructed her to do was to paint over the paint in her home. Because in Buffalo, they want people to think it's just about the paint on their houses and not the water. Because the water would cost, as I said, in Buffalo alone, what was it, $40 billion. Can you imagine the entire state? Can you imagine the entire country? Anyways, yeah, it was something like 40 billion. So in Buffalo, that's another thing that they're trying to do, is to make the residents believe it's in the paint, which it is. They have lead in the paint, they have lead in the pipes coming from the street, and they have lead in the pipes in the house. So they have a lot of fixing to do. And that's why they're doing everything they can to skew the tests and lie, and which they're being successful at. They're burying the truth. They're burying it on purpose. But so they told her, this woman, stay in your home and just paint over the paint in your house because the paint's flaking off and that's where the lead is, which they were right. But even after she painted over the lead in her home, her daughter was still testing high for lead levels. And that's what happened all over Buffalo, is that they were trying to say it's the paint. It's the paint and the lead. It's chipping off. So when people would paint over this lead paint in their house, which is supposed to be how you seal it in and prevent the lead from coming out, the children were still sick. And they would contact the city and they'd say, look, we remediated the lead from the paint in our house, yet my daughter, my son is still sick, still has super high lead levels. And the city said, well, it's you, it's not us. And no, there's no lead in the water. Look, we did this testing. I interviewed another woman who, her daughter had super high lead levels, and they started blaming, they remediated the house, the paint in the house, and they went back to the city and they said, our daughter's still very sick. It has to be in the water. And the city literally first blamed it on the husband, that he's tracking the lead into the house. So take off your boots and your jacket and your everything, change your clothes before you enter the house. So this man would come into the house, stand between the two doorways, take off all his clothes every day after work, put it in a plastic bag, get dressed, come into the house. That's what he had to do to survive. Well, that wasn't working. They got back to the city continuously. They were very persistent. Other people are so tired of it, they just give up. And they told this woman at this time, it's because you're buying toys from the dollar store. And the toys have lead in them. So they got rid of all the toys. The daughter is still sick. The lead's in the water. The lead is in the paint, but the lead is in the water. And they're doing everything they can, as they are in Flint, to hide it. So they're skewing tests. They had a grant program. So this is when the mayor gets on TV and he's like, okay, well, we found lead in some of the houses in Buffalo. We found lead. And we got this grant from the state. We have this program, this green program. We're going to remediate the houses. So this was in 2011. The grant program addressed 1% of the city's total at-risk housing units. Oh, sorry, since 2009. 1% since 2009 they took care of. And that's just talking about paint, because they're still in denial that there's a problem with the pipes and the water in Buffalo, which there is. And sadly, Buffalo had this, what did they call it? $1 million. It was $1 billion it was $1 billion that they were investing into Buffalo's infrastructure. And everybody thought they're going to take care of the lead crisis in Buffalo, and they ended up just actually gentrifying the entire neighborhood and pushing people out of their housing units and moving in, demolishing them, and putting in trendy high-rise lofts that the residents could not afford. So that increased the number of homeless people in Buffalo, which has been, through the roof in the past few years. And they also took that money to put it into the medical corridor. Again, we have Roswell Park, one of the biggest cancer institutes in the country, yet the people who live in that area in the low income neighborhoods can't afford to go to Roswell Park when they get cancer. They get sent to an old hospital outside of the city. But again, a lot of people were pushed out of their homes to build the medical corridor as well. And again, people were pushed out of their homes because they had to build these fancy houses for the new doctors and medical staff coming into work in the medical corridor. So there was a lot of gentrification with that. So instead of using the $1 billion to help the people of Buffalo with the lead crisis, and the lead crisis is just scratching the surface because we have other problems as well with our water, PCBs, coke sludge, arsenic in the water, lupus. It just goes on and on. But none of that $1 billion was spent on the people. It hurt the people more than anything. And that's what's happening nationwide. So let's talk about a Reuters report. The thousands of U.S. locales with lead poisoning. There are thousands of U.S. locales with lead poisoning worse than Flint. Again, this is not to belittle what's happening in Flint at all. It's to say we're just looking at the tip of the iceberg when it comes to this problem. We are just looking at the tip of the iceberg. It's happening nationwide. Reuters report found almost 3,000 areas with poisoning, as in lead poisoning, rates far higher than Flint, Michigan, yet many of these hotspots are receiving little attention and funding. They're really receiving no attention and funding, and Trump has made cuts to that small amount of funding that they had, minuscule amount of funding that they had that wasn't enough to begin with. More than 1,100 of these communities had a rate of elevated blood tests at least 4 times higher than Flint, Michigan. Poison places stretch from Warren, Pennsylvania, Allegheny River. 36% of the children there tested high for lead levels. Buffalo, New York, 40%, 8 times higher lead levels than Flint. Goat Island, Texas, Baltimore, Cleveland, Philadelphia, where poisoning has spanned for generations, and the elevated tests were 40 to 50% of children were testing high for lead levels. Reuters found 2,606 census tracts and another 278 zip code areas with a prevalence of lead poisoning at least twice that of Flint's. That is robbing the future of many, many children, and I don't even know what the future of this country looks like. What happened in the 80s is they had an unexpected spike in the murder rate and violence in the United States. And years later, they found out that it had to do with lead poisoning. So it was the emissions from cars, the gas that they were using at that time for automobiles had lead in it. And the people were breathing in the emissions, which had lead in them, and eventually led to a spike in violence, including murder. What's going to happen? What's going to happen in the United States when these children become adults? A proclivity to violence. What will happen? Oh, well, maybe they leave it this way for the, prison complex. I mean, they seem to enjoy imprisoning American citizens. Well, with all these children being raised with lead poisoning when they're adults, they're going to more than likely have a proclivity to violence, and then what? More people in prison. So that's how they oppress us, and that's how they keep us in line. They do these things on purpose. To think for a minute that the majority of our government does what they do to help the citizens of this country, you would be fooling yourself if you believed that. And it's very sad that they're so manipulative and that they do make people believe whatever they want them to believe. You know, that word be woke has been, a phrase that's been used since Trump has become president. And so many people have had a massive wake up call because of his corruption. But then looking into it, have realized that it's not just Trump, and it isn't just happening now. It's been happening for decades. It's something we have to change. So let's talk about Trump. So very, very tiny help that the country did have to deal with the lead poisoning issue, which was not enough to begin with, Trump has cut. So he advocated for deep federal cuts that would sap billions from programs used by state and local governments to protect children from lifelong health impacts of lead exposure. At least 8 of the 9 federal agencies sharing responsibility for lead poisoning prevention have gotten federal budget cuts. A cut of at least $4.7 billion from programs at HUD and the EPA that supported healthy housing and lead pollution cleanup efforts. Reuters analysis found that funding for a CDC program that assists states with poisoning prevention is now being cut. The Trump administration is eliminating $27 million in programs that train private contractors on lead removal and $21 million in programs that fund lead abatement projects in Alaska, Illinois, Ohio, Oklahoma, and California. They are also killing a program that provided funds for Rhode Island nonprofit to upgrade housing for people that were living in homes with lead. And they're ending a $970 million affordable housing program that has fixed up dilapidated homes in hundreds of U.S. cities, including Flint. So what is the reality of that? More children would be afflicted by learning disabilities and other neurological problems, leaving localities to foot the bill for treatment programs. So all this money that it looks like he's saving now, down the line, it's actually going to cost the United States much more when they have to deal with the medical bills for these children who are sick now and the children who will continue to get sick in the future. And the one thing you'll find with Trump is that he does things to make him look good now, and his base eats it up. No one ever thinks about what are the repercussions of this 5 years down the line, 15, 20, 25 years down the line. As long as it looks good now, right now, they can say, great, he's doing a great job. We voted for the right guy. Screw you, snowflakes. But the truth is that all these cuts are going to end up backfiring on us, and we will end up footing the bill down the line for these sick children. And there's going to be a lot more problems than just that they're sick. I mean, some of them will be unemployed because they are sick. And it's not just physically, neurologically, and mentally. Lead poisoning causes depression, mood swings. It's frightening. Once you have lead poisoning, it doesn't go away. It is permanent. HUD's Healthy Homes and Lead Hazard Control Program is slated to receive. Yeah, so this is also another tactic that they do, where they'll do something that looks really good, and that's what they'll talk about in the press. I'm talking about corrupt politicians in general, but then they won't tell you what they've done offset this great deed that they did. So in regards to lead, this is something that Trump's incredible Nobel Peace Prize administration has done. So they HUD's Healthy Homes and Lead Hazards Control Program is slated to receive $20 million boost. But on the back end of that, the agency has proposed eliminating $4.1 billion worth of grant programs to that local officials say play a bigger role in reducing risks. So out there in the public, they're saying, "Hey, we're giving HUD $20 million," but behind the scenes, they're eliminating $4.1 billion in grant programs. So it's all a big lie. It's all a big show. It's all calculated, and people are incredibly sick. So I'm going to, post an interview with a young a mother and her daughter, and you can hear from someone exactly what the effects of lead are on this family, on this child, and the struggles that she's gone through, and the fight that she's had with all of the agencies that are supposed to be protecting her and her family are actually working against her, and they're doing absolutely everything they can to make sure that she doesn't get help and she doesn't get assistance. So I'm going to post that video, and later I'll also post a video of another woman who has a lot of insight into the lead problem, and she is one of the largest fighters in Buffalo, New York, who has been trying to raise awareness for years. Her daughter has lead poisoning, her son has lead poisoning, and she has lupus, and we'll get into that later because there's other, all across the country, people are sick, and they like you to think that it's genetics. In reality, the majority of the time, there's a lot of things going on, but environmental pollution is one very large issue of why people in this country are sick, and a lot of people don't even know it because the government will have you believe otherwise. So that's just a little input on what's happening in Buffalo. And like I said, this is what Jordan found out while he was in Flint. They were having the people run the tap water before testing it. They were testing areas that people were not testing high for lead levels, and then going out in public and saying the water's clean to drink. They have cheats. They have cheats. And they cheat. So again, please pay attention to who's running for what in the upcoming elections, and don't fall for another corporate politician who cares about money and donors more than they care about people. It's really in our hands, but how much can we do when they skew the voting as well? What a country. Just keep fighting. Second thing today I want to talk about is the Poor People's Campaign. I covered that I think 2 weeks ago. This is a nationwide campaign where they have actions once a week. And what happens when people go out in public and say, "Hey, look, we want a living wage. We don't have enough money to survive. I have 2 jobs and I'm still on food stamps and I can't support my child." What happens when people go out in public and try to speak to their elected officials and say, "I don't have clean drinking water and my family's sick"? What happens when people go out and try to speak to their elected officials, have their voices heard, and they say, "We have a problem in this country. We have a problem where a huge portion of the people in this country are poor and suffer from poverty"? What happens when citizens of the United States try to speak to their government officials, try to make changes, try to raise awareness? They get arrested. Unarmed, nonviolent, peaceful protesters, including members of clergy, elderly people, people with disabilities, they get arrested. That's what happens when you live in a fascist country. And Russia's fascist, but the United States is home of the free. Is it? We are free, but we might get arrested. Not funny. So dozens of people were arrested for civil disobedience in protests in cities across the United States Monday on a national day of action for the new Poor People's Campaign. And I explained what the Poor People's Campaign was in my previous video, but thousands of low-wage workers, clergy, community activists held sit-ins, marches, rallies, all calling for lawmakers to guarantee health care and a healthy environment for all. That's too much to ask for in our country. In Washington, D.C., 28 people were arrested while protesting the disproportionate impact of disasters such as Hurricane Maria on the poor. In Topeka, Kansas, 16 people were arrested as they demanded Medicaid expansion at the state capitol building. In Kentucky, 400 activists were denied entry to the state capitol Monday while protesting the nation's first work requirements for Medicaid. So, do we have these problems in this country? I mean, conservatives would have you believe that we don't have these problems in this country. Well, let's look into it. Do we have a problem with healthcare in this country? 29 million Americans today still do not have health care. 29 million Americans do not have health care. And millions more are underinsured and cannot afford the high co-pays and deductibles charged by private health insurances companies. According to Gallup Sharecare Wellbeing Index, the number of Americans without health insurance increased by $3.2 million during President Trump's first year in office. The 1.3 percentage point increase in the uninsured rate was the highest increase seen since 2008, 2 years before Obamacare became a law. An estimated 20 million people gained health insurance coverage through the ACA, which included not only the offering of plans sold by the Obamacare exchange, but also expansions of Medicaid benefits to more poor adults in most states. Repealing Obamacare individual mandate would increase the number of uninsured by 13 million by 2026. Obamacare repeal bill would raise the number of uninsured to 32 million Americans by 2026. That sounds like a healthcare problem. I do believe that that really does sound like we have a problem with healthcare in this country. I don't know, conservatives, what do you think? The rise of uninsured rates was most pronounced among younger adults, Blacks, Hispanics, and low-income people. So yes, I do believe that the Poor People's Campaign, raising awareness to the struggles of Americans, poor people, is necessary. And to put them in jail, to try to quiet their voices instead of listening to them and trying to help them. What are we asking for in this country that we shouldn't be? Why would you imprison people who are just trying to speak to the lawmakers about poverty, about people dying because they don't have adequate health care? Imprison them? Imprison them? Because you're on our front steps. You're on our front steps. So you're going to jail. Not, oh, I'm sorry, what are you saying? You have a family member who died because he couldn't afford insurance. He couldn't afford chemo, so he died. You have a son who can't afford his chemo, and you don't know how you're going to pay for it. Let me speak to you. Let me solve that problem for you. Let's all work together. Hey, senators, congressmen, let's figure that out, because there's people in our country who are dying because they can't afford health care. No, Instead, let's arrest them because they're standing on our front steps, because they're in our hallway, because they're in that park. Do we really have a problem in the environment? Let's see. 13.8 million US households cannot afford water. Federal assistance in local water systems is currently 74% below its peak in 1977. This has contributed to the inability of public water utilities to address failing and aging infrastructure, like lead lines. It has also prompted utilities to privatize their water systems. Private water utilities charge 59% more per unit of water than publicly owned water systems. Nearly 12% of the US households face unaffordable water bills. Unaffordable water bills. Yet Nestle pays, I think, what, $200 for acres and acres of land to pull the water up out of the ground and then charge people $2 a bottle. But because their tax cut water out of the ground in California, which is leading to the dry foliage, which is leading to the record high numbers of devastating forest fires in California. I mean, with the global warming, add that to the fact that they're sucking the water out of the ground, which is literally causing also more erosion and dust and wind, so that these forest fires are also spreading faster over the already dry foliage. But as long as Nestle is pumping that water and selling it for $2 a bottle, well, then that is a good economy. Screw the 12% of US households who can't afford their water bills. And how about the ones in Flint who face eviction because they can't afford their water bills and their water, which is poison, not only to drink, but to shower in, to wash their clothes in. They took the water pods out of Flint, yet Nestle sucks the water out of the ground for free and resells it for $2 a bottle. That is a good economy. In the United States, we are doing a good job, bang up job. I'm sorry, I'm like sarcastic today. Yes, tens of thousands of households, and this is back to, do we have an environmental problem in this country? Because the people who were protesting this week that got arrested said, we have a problem in this country with, we want a better environment for all of us to live in, a healthier environment. So back to that. At least 4 million families with children are being exposed to high levels of lead from drinking water and other sources. Tens of thousands of households had their water shut off due to non-payment, precipitating homelessness, child removal, and a host of medical problems. Literally, these people cannot afford their water bills. The water is being shut off, and then they're coming and they're taking their children away from them, saying that they're living in unsuitable living conditions. And yet these people are getting arrested for trying to fix this situation. Poor rural, I can never say that word. Poor communities face the additional problem of lacking access to piped water and sewage systems. And I know this for a fact. My friend who lives in Arizona on a reservation, they don't have piped water going to their house. They have to travel to get their water. And unfortunately, that water is also contaminated with uranium, like dust from the old uranium mines. So there's another reservation near Bears Ears in Utah. A friend of mine goes out there. He has a water system that he also took to Puerto Rico that actually cleans contaminated water. He's doing this, you know, the government's not helping him do this. He's doing this with the money that he's raised to help the people on the reservation have clean drinking water. So, yeah, poor communities face an additional problem of lacking access to piped water and sewage systems. They don't have it there. Of the 20 counties with the highest percentage of households lacking access to complete plumbing, 13 had a majority Native American or Alaskan Native population. But that's what we do, right? We ignore the people who have the smallest voice. It's not the rich people. If you were in a high-rise apartment in the condos in New York City and they didn't have their water was shut off for one day, that shit would be all over the news and it would be fixed within 24 hours. Yet the people in 13 counties, Native American and Alaska Native American, lacking access to complete plumbing in the United States, no one hears about it and no one's trying to fix it. The U.S. is the world's largest producer of both gas and oil. As the rest of the country signs the climate agreement, the rest of the world signs the climate agreement, and they're all taking actions to, not all, but they are taking actions to move towards renewable energy. Not the United States. No, we're increasing our use of oil and gas, and we're increasing fracking, and we're trying to push coal at this point. Since 1998, there have been 5,712 significant oil and gas leaks or ruptured in the United States pipelines. Since 1964, there were more than 2,400 spills from offshore drilling in the U.S. waters. Deepwater Horizon BP oil spill in 2010 accounted for 95% of oil spilled in the past 50 years. There's also more than 1,100 coal ash sites throughout the country, and these sites, toxins from these sites gradually leach into the water bodies and the groundwater or get released in catastrophic spills, and this has been happening all over the United States. Yet Trump has slashed any protections that we had on the coal. There used to be something with the EPA that prevented companies from dumping coal into the waterways, and Trump got rid of that. Just straight up got rid of it. Like, what is going on? There is no trying to hide what he's doing. It's just he runs on it's a show. It's a circus. So instead of the news of you hearing about Trump got rid of this protection and now coal companies can throw their toxins into the water, which will end up killing people and the ecosystem. You don't hear that on the news. You hear Stormy Daniels. You hear Trump's trying to pardon himself. Everything he does is incredibly strategic to distract us, to put the focus on this frickin' circus, like tabloid shit, and behind the scenes is where they're really doing the damage. So while everybody's focused on Stormy Daniels and focused on, Trump's crazy tweets, which are significant because he is the leader of the country and the leader of one of the, if not the most powerful countries in the world, it is significant, his tweets, and it is significant that he's effing crazy. But it's also a tactic so that we're not paying attention to the fact that on July 9th, 27,000 people, elderly people in, I think it was Indiana, are being kicked out of retirement homes because they're losing their health care insurance. And more thousands of people are being kicked out of rehabilitation centers, and thousands of people are being kicked out of mental health facilities. That's not what people are talking about. They don't want you to know that. So he gets on the toilet at 3 a.m. and he tweets the craziest shit in the world. So that's all people are like no longer going to have healthcare insurance. Look at the amount of people that died in Puerto Rico. Bullshit that there was only 47 people who died, or 60, whatever the number was. Rosa Clemente, who I spoke to, was there, and she told me months ago that she saw them. She was in Puerto Rico. Check out her website. She saw the dead bodies. She saw FEMA loading dead bodies into trucks. Hundreds of them she saw with her eyes. She knew back then people were dying, because what happens when you don't have electricity and people are on breathing apparatuses and they have dialysis and babies need their machines to survive. People die. That's what happens. So all of a sudden we have numbers coming out. What was it? More than 4,000 people died in Puerto Rico. And believe me, that's not even probably close to the truth. But they don't want you to listen to that. So then Trump comes off with some crazy ass tweet that everybody's on social media. Hey, Trump said this. Hey, Trump said this. And you get your memes, and then you get your freaking conservatives and your liberals fighting. And it's a big smoke and mirrors. So no one's paying attention to the fact that he's trying to, that he's opening up drilling in national parks and protected areas all over the country, that he's wiping out grizzly bears in Yellowstone, that he's wiping out wolves and bears in Alaska, that he's allowing freaking assholes to go in there with their guns and shoot these bears and wolves from freaking helicopters, or go into dens of wolves while they're hibernating and kill the cubs and the mothers. Because that's, number one, he's appeasing his base, because the American Federation of Hunting gave him millions of dollars, and his son's buddy with all of them, but also because he wants to open up the Arctic for drilling, and which he is. But they don't want you to listen to that. They don't want you to talk about that. So 3 a.m., crazy ass tweet, and everybody's talking about that. And then you got Tomi Lahren posting some shit where she's dressed like a superwoman, and then she's got some other woman and calling herself the best and calling liberals losers. And now everybody's fighting about that, and nobody's paying attention to the fact that our country, global warming, climate change could literally destroy our civilization. No one talks about that, because we all like the gossip. We all like the BS. And Trump is the king of the gossip. That's how he won. That's how he is where he is. And it's sad. It's like the minds of Americans are just polluted. The way that we've turned on each other. I've lost best friends. I've come close to having serious problems with family members because they are turning us against each other. Meanwhile, my friends in downtown Buffalo have 21-year-old sons who are dying of lupus because of PCBs in the soil, yet the mayor's on the news saying everyone's healthy, and the people in suburbs are like, what are those people in the inner city complaining about? Tell them to pull up their boots. Because they're dying? Because their children are dying? Maybe that's why they're complaining. But nobody understands oppression if it's not happening to them. And I just lost connection. That was my cue to stop. But look, anything I report about, it all boils down to one thing. We live in a sick, oppressed country where they have tactics to turn us against each other and to distract us from the real problems. Okay, am I done here? Back to the greenhouse emissions. I just want to say, and I think this is the last thing. No, it's not. Let me get back to the story here. So the United States is second in greenhouse emissions to China in 2017. But China since then has become the powerhouse of renewable energy. So China accounted for a record 45% of global investments in renewable energy last year. So that just leaves the United States. still pushing coal, oil, gas, fracking, fossil fuels, and the rest of the world suffers. You heard about the heat waves in India, the record number of people dying. What do you think is going to happen when the land no longer has can yield crops, and then you have people migrating inland, or the islands that are being covered by water, that are literally, civilizations have lived on these islands in the North Pacific for forever, and they're moving off the island because it's being covered with water, and they're finding, what the hell is that? They're being pushed out of wherever they're trying to go. Let me tell you, I know about that. My family's Roma Gypsies. We were pushed out of our original place back, at the beginning of time, and everywhere the Roman Gypsies tried to migrate to land, they were pushed out. They were made. What happens when communities try to migrate and move into areas? They're not welcome. What happened to my people? Slavery, mass. They were put in the concentration camps eventually, but that's the entire history of Roma Gypsies, is what's going to happen to this entire planet when you have a civilization, a community who's migrating. They are not accepted anywhere else, and that leads to violence and wars and inhumanity. And that's what's going to happen when we keep pumping out fossil fuels and killing the environment. We are contributing so much to global warming, and other people will suffer, other countries will suffer for our greed. And it's not really us, it's the politicians. Are people poor in this country? Lastly, the poor people's hold on here. The Poor People's Campaign is about poor people. Now, I've heard a lot of people say, what are they complaining about? We don't have that much poverty in this country. Poverty is so much worse in other countries. They should be grateful. All right, let's look at the stats. Do we have a problem with poverty in this country? According to the Supplemental Poverty Measure, the SPM, 43% of the U.S. population, or 140 million people, were poor or low income in 2016. 51.9% of children under the age of 18, that makes 38.2 million children, were living in poverty in 2016. 47% of adults between the ages of 18 and 64, that means 81.5 million American adults, were living in poverty in 2016. 42.5% of our elders over the age of 65, 20.8 million elderly people, were living in poverty in 2016. And now so many of them will be losing health care and losing their lives. 45% of women and girls, 73.5 million women and girls, were living in poverty in the United States. Important. 33.9% of white people, that's 67.1 million. 60.3% of black people, 25.9 million black people living in poverty. I'm sorry. Yeah. Why are those numbers wrong? 65.1% of Latino people, that's 37.4 million people. Oh, okay. Living in poverty. And 41.1% Asian people, that's 7.6 million people living in poverty in 2016, Asian people. So there is grossly inadequate information when it comes to Native American, Alaskan American, First Nations, and the LGBTQIA. Like, they're not even, and the disabled people, they're not even gathering proper information when it comes to these groups of people. They just don't even bother to gather information. When it comes to this group of people, there's grossly inadequate information on poverty in these groups of people. But according to the existing information by the OPM, 26.2% of Native Americans were living below the poverty level. That's 1.7 million people. And 26.6% of people with disabilities were living below the poverty level. 5.3 million people with disabilities are living below the poverty level. That None of this should be. None of this should be. But it goes to show it's, what do they think this is? Like, I heard someone say, conservative the other day say it's survival of the fittest. It's survival of the fittest. Oh, okay. So because you were dealt a hand, you were born in a certain family, in a certain neighborhood, with certain blessings, it's survival of the fittest. What if you weren't born there? What if you were born? What if you were in someone else's shoes? They can't imagine that. They don't care. Transgender people are likely to experience poverty at a rate double that of the general population, with transgender people of color experiencing even higher poverty rates. So that's what, you know, when the Poor People's Campaign, when they go out and they say they're trying to raise awareness about poverty, they're trying to raise awareness about the failing American healthcare system. They're trying to raise awareness that people are not living in a healthy environment in the United States. That's what they're talking about. That is what they're talking about. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. So instead of our politicians listening to them, they arrest them. They arrested them. Monday's actions are the fourth week of nonviolent direct action from the Poor People's Campaign. Reverend Dr. William J. Barber was one of the founders and leaders. He was arrested the very first week. He said, "That's not America. People who want health care, who are dying because they don't have it, have a right to readdress their government. This is a public building." They were arrested in a public building. The Poor People's Campaign website said, "They tried and they failed to silence Kentucky Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival yesterday, but we'll be back in Frankfort, Kentucky, and Washington, D.C., and in state capitals across the country next Monday for our next day of moral direct action. We won't be silent anymore about the war on the poor." So good for them. If you want to check that out, www.poorpeoplescampaign.org, or check them out on Facebook. They have videos and they would like you to share their live feeds, and that's a way that you can get the word out about what's going on and help with that. We do have access to social media, and we know that the corrupt people are using social media to their advantage. So go ahead, post the information, share the live feeds on your Facebook account. And believe me, if you have friends who are conservative or who are against this, and you think they're not watching it because you're not getting likes or notifications from them, you never know. They actually might watch it, and you actually might open up someone's eyes to the struggles of other people in this country by sharing this information. I mean, plant the seed. Plant the seed. Plant tons of seeds. Let's see if we can grow a forest, because we sure as hell need it. And on that note, before I leave you, let me say, please plant seeds for the bees. We need to repopulate, rebuild the bee population. It is serious. And this is, I'm not getting sponsored by Cheerios, but I will tell you that Cheerios is giving away free wildflower seeds to feed the bees on their website. All you have to do is go and, you know, they'll send you a free pack of wildflowers to feed the bees. I did it, and I have all these little green sprouts coming up all over my garden, and I do leave my lawn unmowed for as long as I possibly can, and it's a joy to watch the bees popping from flower to flower and busy. And that's a part of coexisting, and that's another problem that we have. We can't just control everything and think that we have the right to every inch of this planet. It's another problem that we have in general. So coexist. Get out there, sit out in your backyard, watch the bees, try to connect for a minute. Brings you peace. If people could do that more often, people might not be so angry in this country too. We've really lost connection to the earth, to the animals, to each other. But yeah, check it out. Go to, I don't know, I can't remember his name right now. He spoke at the climate march in Washington. It was amazing. They donated a whole like 45 minutes to talking about the bees. We need to help them out because they help us. And believe me, if our vegetables and fruits are not being pollinated, we be screwed. We be screwed. So that's it. Thanks for joining me today. I'm going to post that interview, the 2 interviews or whatever. I have so many of all the research that I've done in Buffalo, New York, where I spoke to real people about the problems of lead poisoning. And if you didn't get a chance, please check out Jordan's, all the videos that he did while he was in Flint. He's just trying really hard to help the people there. And this will in turn, I mean, if you think about it, the problem that's in Flint is the same problem that's in Buffalo. And we're just 2 people that found this out, Jordan and Flint, me in Buffalo. Imagine the problem nationwide. So if you are a subscriber to Jordan's channel, thank you. His goal is to eventually start Status Coup and get a lot of other journalists out on the street doing what he did in Flint, so that we can change the country, so that we can help people. And I'm not exaggerating when I say save lives. So if you're a subscriber, thank you so much. $1 a month, $5 a month, 10 if you're loaded, 50, 100, bring it. I'm not. But thank you, and stay tuned, and have a great day. Don't lose hope. Just because we're talking about the problems in the country doesn't mean that we can't fix them. The fact that we are talking about them and sharing the truth is more than we've done in the past. We will change the future this way. So yes, I do. Goodbye.